The wheel of time turns and ages come and pass, leaving memories that become legend. Legend fades to myth, and even myth is long forgotten when the age that gave it birth comes again.
Welcome to Through the Glass Columns, a Wheel of Time read-along podcast. Each week, we will be reading, discussing, and digesting a small selection from Robert Jordan's fantasy opus. This quest is led by Tylor, a true Wheel of Time warrior.
I have all stories, ages that were and that will be. And I'll be joined by Greg, a complete novice to the Wheel of Time.
The Wheel of Time and the wheel of a man's life turn alike without pity or mercy.
Join us each week as we read the Wheel of Time in our own sweet time, traveling deeper and deeper through the glass columns.
But what does that even mean?
No. You don't get to find out yet. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Through the Glass Columns, your weekly Wheel of Time read-along podcast. I am Tylor, a person who knows a lot about the Wheel of Time, and I am joined by Greg, who increasingly knows a decent amount about the Wheel of Time. Greg, how are things going?
Oh man, we are deep into hot nerd autumn, and I think everybody else is going crazy for Game of Thrones, Lord of the Rings, the new George Miller fantasy movie, and I get to throw just a good dose of Wheel of Time on there, just a year after everybody else did it. So I'm great. A hot nerd autumn is totally just an amazing amount of fantasy. So how are you doing?
I am doing well. I'm about to go on the Galactic Star Cruiser in 2 days, so it's about as good as things get from my perspective. And why don't we actually just dive right in, unless you had anything else preemptively?
No,
that wasn't a word close enough. So before we dive in, I did just briefly want to talk about why we are not having an ill-advised discussion of non-visual whatever. Okay. The chapter icon on chapter 28 is Moiraine's staff. We already talked about it. Interesting discussion. The chapter icon on chapter 27 is the trefoil leaves. And the last time we came across this, we said this is a symbol that is going to often represent Nynaeve. That is one of the things, but let's punt this until we know all of the ways that this symbol is used. This chapter indicates the second way that this symbol is typically used. It's often a symbol for the Tuatha An, and it's similarly, I think, their connection to nature, and obviously the way of the leaf and the leaves makes a large amount of sense. That being said, we have two more ways that this symbol is commonly used, and so I would like to be able to discuss all four and their linkages before we have the full discussion. So let's move on to the recap, but keep that in mind. Tuatha An, also this symbol.
And I got to ask this one question about it. Is that one of the symbols in your tattoo?
It is not.
Okay. It hasn't made the arm yet or ever?
Ever.
Oh, okay.
Oh, probably ever. This is something I need to talk to a tattoo artist about.
Nice.
I have plans. Okay, so the recap of chapter 27, Shelter from the Storm. So initially, we kind of get a description of Perrin getting increasingly nervous about how slow the wagons are moving with the Tuatha An. And he constantly is kind of pushing Elias, can we leave? Can we go? How can we move faster? And we eventually kind of get a little bit of a confrontation between Perrin and Elias, where he basically says, I have a bad feeling. I trust my feelings. We're sticking with the Tinkers for a few more days. And that settles Perrin down a little bit. But then we also see some kind of discussion of what Egwene is doing on this trip. And Perrin has some issues with how this is playing out. Egwene is basically spending all of her time either with Isla, and no one is hearing those discussions or knows what is going on, or spends the rest of her time dancing with Aram. And it seems that Perrin, it's not clear whether it's jealousy or his worry that Egwene might be buying into the way of the leaf or exactly what's going on there, but he's clearly conflicted. And this eventually kind of creates a confrontation between them, where basically Egwene says, I'm just going to live my life. I'm going to enjoy it. And she even says, this might be the last time that I'm able to enjoy something like this. And I think that really kind of settles Perrin in a little bit. He also then has a discussion with Isla and some of the Tinkers about his axe. And, briefly, he even starts displaying his axe more boldly, almost just as a show that he is not someone following the way of the leaf. At this point, he has a dream. Baal-Zaman is in it. Baal-Zaman burns a wolf, and when Perrin wakes up, he feels that a wolf has died in pain and fire, and Elias says it's time to leave. And they eventually make their way away from the Tinkers. And in all of this, I'm going to now mention the dancing and the dancing ladies who hug Perrin, because it's not an important plot point, but it was funny. Let's be real about that. And then as they leave, it becomes clear that both Elias and the Tinkers are nervous about something, and both are hurrying away from their current location. So something dangerous is in the air. And that's where we kind of leave things. So, Greg, I actually wanted this week, because I felt like a lot of the important moments from my perspective were character moments rather than like plot or world building moments. That felt like the kind of week to maybe have you lead the discussion a little bit more, just so that I'm not tipping my hand about like mentioning something is important, but the typical reader wouldn't know it's important for 2 books, sort of thing. Does that make sense?
Sure. Yeah. So, that's not to just be totally dismissive, but my notes at the end just kind of say, meh, like this wasn't offensive, but it was kind of a nothing burger of a chapter for me. And, this in the real world, we just took a break between recording these. Sorry, listeners who think we record these live to your iPhone every week. And so it kind of took me a moment to remember, like, well, we did just come off this like awesome chapter, and there was a lot happening in Whitebridge, and so I think then that helped me kind of accept this as a little bit of a palate cleanser, like, okay, like let's slow down again, let's do this. So I think hearing your summary of it and thinking with your prompt about like where should our focus be here, this really feels like we're building up Perrin and really trying to think about where he's at and what kind of balance he's seeking, and then secondarily Egwene. That's not to dismiss Elias and the Tinkerers, which continue to be good world building, but I do think this still feels like we're getting a reset on Perrin as a character. And yet there's a reminder towards the end that he can't just go be Wolf Boy now. Like he's still got larger troubles. So it's like a reset up until the last kind of closing pages, and then it's like, nope, it's you still have the larger problems to deal with. So so I guess let me throw it a little bit back to you and say, like, does this to you feel like we're seeing a transition in Perrin? And decide not to answer or censor your answer however you want.
Yeah, I think I see what you're saying as far as this being kind of a meh chapter. And for me, I think of it as being kind of moving the chess pieces into place, right? This is the chapter that's like the middle game where nothing's getting captured. No one really knows what's happening except the grandmasters, but it needs to happen in order to get to the really exciting things that are happening later, right? And I think that's happening both from a plot perspective, right? It's like they walk down the road for a while with some people who sang some songs and danced some dances. That's the whole chapter. But I also think it's that way in terms of character. And I think that's why you're saying this is kind of like a reset. Is, to me, I don't see it as necessarily a reset, but rather it's kind of our first opportunity to see Perrin at peace, right? The only other chapters that we've seen him, he's fleeing through, dangerous areas, or he's meeting Elias for the first time and is terrified of what it could mean. We're kind of for the first time seeing him just be him. And so to some degree, I think we're seeing his kind of evolution as a character backwards, right? We see him in the pot before we actually see anything else of him. And that's what's interesting to me in this chapter. Is it is a soft reset, but it's a reset in the sense of, if we had been in his head in Emond's Field, we would have been seeing this Perrin. We just weren't. We were in Rand's head at that point.
I like that thinking a lot, and I like trying to place him within that. And what strikes me the most about that as who Perrin is it's really lonely. I mean, as you look across this chapter, there's kind of the initial sentiment that the Tinkerers don't trust him and kind of keep their distance. He senses that distance and kind of senses almost like it's pity, I think, is kind of the reading it gave me. That they see he's not going to follow their ways, and they just kind of think he's just in danger and there's no hope for him almost.
Yeah.
And then he doesn't seem to quite connect with Elias.
Right.
It's not going to be some like wonderful master apprentice. Let's go be wolf men together.
Yeah.
And every time I'm referring to wolf boy or wolfman, in my head I just hear werewolf bar mitzvah. I don't know if you can drop that in post from 30 Rock, but wolf boys becoming wolf men. That's a werewolf bar mitzvah. Okay,
I'm down. Just in case you are wondering terminology, I don't think this has ever actually been used in world, but the title of chapter 23 is Wolf Brother, which is a common term that's used for what Perrin is.
Well, and so there are these moments then where, again, thinking of him as kind of alone, he continues to sense and feels the growth of the characters around him. The wolves particularly.
Mm-hmm.
He can sense where they are. He can sense their changing emotions and the dynamics between them. But he's not welcomed into that, right? Like
right.
Dapple is still kind of skeptical, and the rest are just kind of disengaged. Yeah. So he's alone there, and then as you mentioned in your summary with Egwene's basically like, go away. Like I got a life to live, and it doesn't center around you. Because there was so much on Egwene and Rand, it's kind of always like I never thought there was a chance for Perrin with Egwene, right. And I don't necessarily think that's what Perrin wanted, but it's like very clear, like he is no way involved in the future she envisions, especially perhaps now that, there's a sense she can be an Aes Sedai.
Yeah, and I think that this is kind of setting up what is, at least in the short term, one of the kind of big conflicts for Perrin as a character is that he feels like he's kind of one foot in a lot of different worlds, right? He was a part of the Two Rivers, but he was a blacksmith. He was one of the few people who wasn't involved in farming or sheep or the common things, right? He isn't quite in with Perrin, and he's not quite in with Egwene in the way that he might want
he's
to
not
be.
Really in with Perrin either. Sorry, go ahead. Yes, he's not in with Egwene.
Right. He can't fit in with the Tinkers, even though he empathizes with the Way of the Leaf. He wants to carry his axe. He knows he needs violence, and he's kind of resisting being with the wolves, right? He's pushing them away as much as they're pushing him away. And in fact, I think it's at the end or towards the end of this chapter that the wolves say something along the lines of like he gets a sense of them that they want him to be fully with them or more kind of completely invested in order for them to really relate. And I think that's kind of where Perrin is stuck, at least at this point, is he's kind of philosophically and physically in the middle of a lot of different factions and not really willing to commit to any of them. And his character, as we've learned it, is to be slow and deliberate and thoughtful. And so as more things get piled on him, I think he just gets slower and slower to make those decisions. And that's we'll see where he goes as a character, but that's kind of the roadblock he's at now. And I just have to say, I've mentioned before how much I love Perrin. The wolf that represents Perrin that we'll talk about probably next week is one of the tattoos that's on my arm. And like, I really this has been a story emotionally that I've really related to, kind of just like try to take your time, try to think through it. But when things pile up, I also freeze up. And so as a kid, I feel like this was, I really related to Perrin at a very early age.
Listeners without the video feed, Tylor is now revealing his giant bicep. He's been working out, and the wolf is he can flex the wolf in the tattoo. Sorry, you made a very serious point. And I do think that, when we talk about books that really stick with us. And so I have this thing when I teach my students, I'm going to hear it next week because I know I do. Whenever I give a short story or something, they always say it's not relatable. And I hate this as a response, because I could hand them a short story about a college freshman struggling to fit in at a small New England university. And they'd be like, I couldn't connect with it. It's not relatable. And so my philosophy as somebody who teaches literature is that the power of literature is actually to force the empathy and the connection and the relatability, no matter what the content is. But that is, of course, not at all to dismiss, but just to reinforce your point that when we find ourselves in whatever kind of art or media that we look at, I think that is, it's always it feels a little like self-involved and like
Right.
narcissistic, but it is actually the pathway to letting art deeply affect us, right?
Yeah.
Like, if a character is going through something and you can really truly imagine yourself reacting the way they do, feeling like you're in their shoes, I think
Yeah.
that just makes then the story told, the message shared, the themes. That's what, like, that's the whole shebang, right? I mean,
Right.
literature is supposed to make us forget we're mortal. And what better way to not feel mortal than to see yourself preserved in the print, to see yourself in the story?
I just want to be very clear. I'm happy to be narcissistic when necessary, either for the podcast or just for myself. And I think actually just a sign of this to me is I think we've mentioned before, probably my two favorite Wheel of Time characters are Perrin and Egwene. And even in this scene, there was one scene in here when they kind of had their conflict about, you know, Egwene being too carefree and Perrin wanting to, be really cautious. There was a moment where Egwene just said, like, look, live in the moment. And I was like, hey, I'm kind of proud of myself. Like, I relate to Egwene there instead of Perrin. Good on me, right? Like, and so I think
Yeah.
the fact that this series has so many good characters and pretty much everyone's going to find someone to latch on to in the way that I have to one of these 900 characters or whatever.
Mm.
Hopefully he'll find yours at some point.
Well, and I was just thinking about those two as sides of your psyche, not you personally. I'm not here to psychoanalyze, but I think a lot of us who exist more on the kind of introvert side of the spectrum have those places or those roles where, and I'm sure yours is the classroom like mine is, where it's like, oh, I'm just the leader here and I just need to do it. And I don't necessarily feel that same reluctance or shyness when it's like, I'm in front of the room. It's just time to do my job. And
Yeah.
I think that's the two characters here, right? Perrin wants to be slow, reluctant, methodical. And Egwene is just driven by the clear path she sees in front of her. And when she has that clear goal to become an Aes Sedai, it's like, yeah, I'm gonna dance. This boy is super cute, and I'm just gonna dance with him and flirt with him and enjoy it while I can, because the life ahead will be something different. And again, I'm not saying that's how I approach teaching, but when you have that kind of like drive of like, this is the clear goals and I'm in this role, then it's just easy to act with that that straightforward path.
Yeah, and I think that this is something that I really appreciate that Jordan does is he paints both of them in a really positive light, right? I think it's a really effective strategy. I think it's all too easy when we're in someone's head to have them win the argument in their head and then win the argument out loud. And I think it's a much more effective thing that he does here. We are hearing Perrin talking himself up and winning the argument in his head, and then he loses the argument with Egwene. And I think that's just more interesting from a character perspective, but it's also more interesting as a reader. We're not kind of getting the double beat of hearing it twice. We hear the really effective counterpoint.
Yeah, and a long time ago, actually, in the context of television, I heard it said like, if you really want a good conflict on your show, make both characters correct, right?
Yeah.
And what that really means is that they both are correct from their perspective. And I think you're right that then we get the rug pulled out from us when we naturally side with whoever's head we're in. We've still never been in Egwene's head.
Only 9-year-old Egwene.
Okay, in the prologue.
Yeah, way back in the
okay.
in the children's book prologue. Yeah,
that doesn't really count, kind of, but
yeah,
does
exactly.
count, but doesn't. Yeah. Well, I guess then in that mix, I just want to give a shout out to Elias, who gave off pure DJ from Last Jedi vibes, Benicio del Toro's character, when he said, "Run when you have to, fight when you must, rest when you can." And I was like, that's a bumper sticker right there.
Yeah.
Like
that, I immediately thought of one of my favorite lines from one of my favorite sports movies, Bull Durham. Sometimes you win, sometimes you lose, sometimes it rains. I was like, yep, that's how it works.
Well, and it's that kind of beautiful thing Jordan has done a few times where it's like the simple, just pithy truth is just that. And there's nothing wrong with being a character in this world, at least so far that we've seen, who just does those things, right? There's
Yeah.
space to exist in that way. And it is in itself a rejection of, the tinkerers and, some of the other philosophies we've had. But I just loved the swerve of rest when you can, which is what that life leads to. And that's what Elias has found, is he's always on the go. He can't settle within that. So the only other note I have on this chapter is I thought it was very interesting that Elias has a clear premonition. He calls it the something. Something tells him he shouldn't leave yet. They should wait. And Perrin is essentially having the opposite, but he doesn't describe it the same way. He's basically always having this feeling that they're putting the Tinkerers in danger and they just need to go and get away from them. And it was kind of like, it was presented as him just feeling guilty, kind of that natural way that he shouldn't. But I was like, this is hypothesizing, irresponsible speculation. It felt to me like he was actually having the same kind of premonition. It's like his premonition is saying, like, go, like, get out of here now, whatever that kind of gut instinct is. And yet he could kind of write his off as nervousness or naivete or something like that, whereas Elias is like, no, I've had these feelings many times, they're always right, they're telling me not to go yet.
You are absolutely correct, and as you are saying this, I was comparing it to the conflict of the wolves in this chapter, and it actually kind of fits, right? Elias is Dapple, he's like, no, my way or the highway, and then Egwene is kind of like taking the like Hopper role of like, I'm just with him, like I'm along for the ride. And then Perrin would be, I guess, not Burn left, Wind, who is just like, no, I want to get away from these humans. Let's just get this job done with, right? So it's kind of the same conflict mirrored there. And it may be, right, if we're thinking about this in terms of premonitions as something more than just gut, if we're, intuiting that it might be a wolf thing, right? Different wolves are having different intuitions on the situation. Yeah. So the same thing could be happening with Elias and Perrin.
And again, I think there's been this constant theme that there are forces at work on the characters that they don't fully comprehend. And so, okay, so now I'm thinking about the opening sigil of the leaves. It's like, okay, there's a natural power. There's something there, in D&D, this would be druidical or something like that. I mean, also druids exist outside of Dungeons and Dragons, but that's where my head went. So it feels like there is perhaps, in Game of Thrones, there's the old gods of the trees and the woods in the north, the ravens. And it feels almost like that, like some kind of natural power that pre-exists the world of man or the society of men. So,
and we do actually get in this chapter one brief mention, not explicitly of what you're describing, but something kind of that sounds similar. We hear the Tinkers talk about they may go to an Ogier steading, and it's described as like a place of peace where no one will be bothered. And Elias says, well, the Ogier don't let people in. And I think it's either Isla or Rayan, I forget which one of them. They say basically, well, the Tinkers can go anywhere. And so we do have some hint of like a place of peace somewhere that feels non-human, right? It's related to Ogier, whatever those are, rather than, human. So it's actually kind of very similar to what you're describing. We get our first reference to it, I think, in this chapter.
Ogier sounds like ogre to me. I guess that's probably the most obvious thing to say in the world.
It's actually the first joke they do on the television show.
Oh, okay, but seemingly different then, seemingly not that exact thing. So I think, so I guess I do have one final note. The dream where Baal Zaman does show up again. I think I hit that in my opening remark, which is just a reminder that, this is all cute and fun, but it's not the end game here. That the wolves will mean nothing if Perrin thought that was his kind of road to salvation. But I did note that he said, if you are the one, you are are mine. And very ominous, I will say, I guess, again, because of the way things have been structured and we spent so long in his head. I'm like, oh, don't worry, buddy, you're not the one, right? It is very much when Sauron sees Pippin in Return of the King. I think it's like, he's like, oh, halflings, like, yeah, there. It's like, no, he's not the one. Like, you're good. That's just Pippin, fool of a toad. So I think I immediately was like, well, maybe but so I guess the way I'll phrase this is, but I absolutely believed that, right? Like, if he is the one, he does not stand a chance against this force. But I think I'm already pretty sure it's not him at all. So we'll see where that goes.
Well, and I think this is Baal-Zamon's first slip. Every time before this, he has always implied that he is more or less omniscient, right? He claims to know about Rand's parentage. He claims all of these, grand historical things. I think this is the first time that he's kind of inadvertently admits that he doesn't know who he's searching for, right? He says, you might be the one.
Yeah. Ooh, good. Okay. So he is limited in some fashion.
And we actually get a little bit of a hint of that in the next chapter, chapter 28, Footprints in Air. Look at that transition.
Oh, beautiful. Hit me with that summary.
So Nynaeve begins the chapter in awe of Whitebridge, but is unwilling to show her awe to Moraine or Lan. She's worried that they'll think she's just a country bumpkin. Moraine basically explains that she doesn't have a full link to the boys anymore because they've given away their coins, but she has a limited link. If she gets, I think later in the chapter, she says within a half mile or so, she would know approximately where they were. But Nynaeve is really frustrated because in their travels, Moraine basically hasn't given her any information and just keeps pushing her to go to Tar Valon and eventually become an Aes Sedai. And Nynaeve is kind of very resistant to that idea, but she's already also accepted that if she wants to, she will go, just not for the reason Moraine is asserting. We basically get a couple of scenes that show everyone is on edge. And then Lan tries to talk Nynaeve into going back to the Two Rivers, despite the fact that he says she's perfectly safe. But Moraine asserts that Nynaeve is part of the pattern, and so she has to continue on. Eventually, they cross the bridge and get into the village of Whitebridge, where it is apparent that there have been a number of fires around town. After asking around, they get a couple of lies, they get a couple of evasions, but eventually they find out that something happened that got a mob stirred up, and that mob went to what we presume is Baal Domon's ship and basically chased him out of town. We also later on learn Nynaeve is able to find out that Tom was on the ship, and so she suspects that they may have gone south, but Lan learns that there was a merge rail. He can sense it with his warder abilities. And so while they don't discern what happened between Tom and the merge rail, they at least are aware that both of them were in the area. And Moraine eventually decides that since she won't be able to track the boys until she gets close, but they're almost certainly heading for Caemlyn, she will go and get what we know is Perrin, and then go to get the other boys in Caemlyn. The only thing I think else worth mentioning in this chapter is that Nynaeve does challenge Moraine when she mentions wanting to get the boys about whether or not she cares about Egwene. And Moraine gives one of her characteristically cold answers and basically says, I don't let the resources that valuable slip out of my hands, and implies that Nynaeve is also a resource that valuable. So with that threat hanging in the air, Greg, why don't you take over?
So our friendship is newer than one of my favorite television shows of all time, which was Mad Men. And so I
also
don't know.
One of mine.
Oh, okay, good. So if you had the pleasure of watching Mad Men week to week when it was airing, they had these brilliant Next Time on Mad Men, which would just
be my favorite part of Mad Men.
And I think there was a Saturday Night Live parody about this at some point, I want to say. Didn't John Mulaney write one? Is that right?
I think so. I know the one that I was familiar with is at the time there was like an ESPN like sports satire, like long form journalism site called Grantland, and they had an amazing analysis of like the weekly breakdown of the Next On. It was fantastic.
Yeah. So people who may not be familiar. So the brilliance of them was that you would watch them and they would just be characters saying lines, and you'd stack up like 7 or 8 characters saying lines, and none of it made sense. You had no context whatsoever. And yet you were like, hot dang, I gotta see I want to watch that show now. Like, I gotta see this.
It was literally just like characters ominously being like, come in. I can't believe this. Someone died. And then like that was it.
Yes. So all of that is preamble to say that's what my notes look like for this chapter, is that there were so many great quotes that if I read down my list, it just seems like a next time on Mad Men. Poised on the brink, feel of the world. She is part of the pattern. The wheel weaves as the wheel wills. No eye can see the pattern until it is woven. And those are like so delicious and intriguing and just like draw you in. And yet it's like, what are we even talking about? Like, if you said go out to the subway station and say those, and people are going to like crowd the other end of the platform away from you.
Reading Wheel of Time out loud is actually going to be my new strategy if I need space on the train. Thank you for that, Greg. No, and I think you're right. This is such an interesting chapter for me because it's beautifully written. It is a really good character study of the Nynaeve Moraine tension that is building. And that's it. It gives us nothing else new other than that there was a mob of people. Like, what? Is that important information? It doesn't seem like valuable to us at all. And so this very much is just like, let's get the chess pieces where they need to be. We need to explain why they stopped chasing Rand and Matt and started chasing Perrin. That's it. It's what it's there for.
Yeah, and I would only layer onto that the fact that it's a funny chapter because of dramatic irony. Then on top of everything you just said, we know everything revealed here, but we do need to see the characters learn these things. I mean, these are the kind of things that, some nerd would raise their hand and, Mr. Jordan, how did Moraine know to travel north to find Perrin? And it's like, he has to give us this chapter, like to be like, they can go here. It's even funny that he kind of makes up new powers. Like, yeah, he can just sense it, and then they can go north or what have you. So, I mean, I guess tracking some of that, it's just nice to know that Moraine can still sense them. I think there was some fear where they lost the coins, and that was such a particular thing that was specified. So it is kind of funny that we kind of hand wave that away, or at least put a new limit on that power, which is perhaps, in classic video game sense, power capping. And then I think other than that, this idea, making sure that we, the audience, know that Nynaeve is now going to be important.
Yeah.
All the premonitions of that, the character whose name I'm forgetting, who said she could see the pattern.
Moraine?
Nope.
Min.
Back in the first year. Min. Min gave us a bunch of those clues, but everything was left pretty vague or symbolic or metaphorical. Whereas Moraine is just clearly like, nah, she's in the pattern. And so like she has to come along and be a part of this now.
Yeah. And I think one thing so first off, my initial impression when you said that this was the kind of thing someone at a con would stand up and say, my immediate response was yes. And that's the kind of thing that gets cut out of modern movies. And I don't care. And that's why I like Rise of Skywalker, right? Like this is the scene that I feel like a lot of people need in their movies to explain the minute detail. And I'm like, cut it. Robert Jordan, I did not need chapter 28. Like, give me an extra,
figured it out.
Yeah, give me an extra 2 pages of Nynaeve in the previous chapter for the character work, and I'm done. That's all I need.
Yeah. And it is another kind of mirror of that thing we've talked about before, where the characters pass through after the action. And it's interesting in this regard that we got immediately preceding it, and then we get the aftermath, which again, I still like as a strategy, because I really find the action parts often not that exciting in any source. I'm not picking on this book, certainly. So, then what is the chapter really about? It's just that tension.
Yep.
It rang true to me that Elias had just warned us again in the previous chapter, like, be careful about getting so wrapped up with an Aes Sedai.
Yeah.
And yet I find myself not listening to any of those. I'm still like, yeah, trust Moraine.
Yeah.
So I guess when she inevitably betrays everybody or pursues her own agenda that upends the group, I'm going to be disappointed and sad, probably in the ways I'm supposed to. But I do definitely feel my sentiments, despite every warning, are still with her.
Yeah, and I wholeheartedly agree with you, and I certainly did the first time I read this. I'm curious because as we're talking about Moraine, this is an interesting chapter because we're not seeing Moraine from Rand's perspective, who I think also shares our relative ambivalence towards her and, thinks of her generally as a positive force. I think he believes his father, right? Tam said, trust the Aes Sedai. This is kind of our first time seeing Moraine portrayed from the perspective of someone who clearly does not like Aes Sedai, right? She refers to Tar Valon as like an evil place and channeling as something she never wants to be involved with, even as she admits she's probably going to go learn to do it. Right. So I'm curious how you thought of that kind of like semi-contradictory nature of Nynaeve, and also how you were thinking about that kind of coloring the way that Moraine is painted in this chapter, because it's our first kind of negative portrayal of her.
To be completely honest, I think my head was still primarily in the place of, well, but Nynaeve just doesn't get it. She doesn't see the whole thing. I mean, we've said before, Moraine is playing 3-dimensional chess while everybody else is playing on a game board. And so I do think that that's where my mind goes immediately. It's, and it seems silly to say Nynaeve, naive, right? It just kind of naturally reminds you, like, yeah, she doesn't get it all, or she's too focused on something, short-sighted perhaps, or myopic. And so to think about, I think my sentiments continue to say, well, she just doesn't get it, more than she has some healthy misgivings. Now, sitting back and talking about it, I think, again, you have a nice little town that you're the wisdom of, and you've got everything running with yourself empowered just the way you want to be. A lady comes, then a giant army, and then the lady disappears with 4 kids. Like, yeah, I wouldn't be trusting this woman. And I think, that means, well, it's what we said last chapter. That means it's 2 characters who are both right. They are. Nynaeve is absolutely right to have that skepticism and to not want to give it up. And Moraine is right to just be like, you're small and you don't understand the larger flow, the larger, what am I going to flow for? The larger pattern. I just read it 3 times in quotes. Yeah. The larger pattern of what's going on. But I will also say, I really appreciate that these references to the pattern demonstrate that she doesn't know the whole pattern. She can only determine when somebody is involved, right? It's like she sees a color in the weaving, not the actual weaving itself. Like, yeah, there's gonna be some purple coming. Like, maybe it's a zigzag, maybe it's a polka dot. I don't know, but
I think that is a very interesting inference. I think what we know is that she somehow knows a few people are involved, but we don't yet know how. I think it could be a power of hers, but other things could be going on there, right? All that we know is that she gathers old stories and was looking for someone of a particular age not born in the 2 rivers, right? So it may even be that she isn't able to see or detect anything. She just has a very specific piece of knowledge that allows her to know things. I think that is a really interesting dynamic right now, is we know kind of to trust Moraine in a vague sense, but we have no idea why or how she knows the things she does.
Yeah, the fictional character that came to mind in your description just there is Sherlock, who seems incredibly smart, but is just really good at reading context clues and seeing dust and knowing train schedules and what have you, right?
Yeah.
So it seems like magic, but it's not. Now, I think we've seen Moraine actually has powers, but to say that this particular one may look more magical than it is, and they're, again, this is a world where we know this has all happened before. So what clues are left from the last time this happened? So, yeah. I
I
think
had
that empties my notes. What do you got?
I had one last thing I just quickly wanted to mention. We spent all of the time in chapter 28 so far talking about Moraine and Nynaeve, but there's a third character in these chapters, right? So
Mm.
Lan is also along for the ride. And I think we get one or two kind of quick Lan Nynaeve moments in this chapter. And so I was curious whether you picked up anything on their dynamic or if you just had any thoughts about Lan in general, or is he just still the blank slate for you?
He seems like a dutiful squire, a familiar trope, right? Like he has his skills and, tracking and, as you mentioned in your summary, he's the one who can kind of figure out a key piece of that. Right, that he can figure out the Murdral was there.
Yeah, so he at a couple times has basically sensed either Trollocs or Murdrail if they're within, again, something roughly like a half mile.
So, and again, there's nothing otherworldly about that to me. It's a dutiful squire who will do whatever Moraine needs him to do, and is able and is apt, right?
Yeah.
He's not a comic relief, or sometimes you have the shining knight and the like
Yeah.
bumbling pudgy uh pod in Game of Thrones. We're very
Yeah.
Game of Thrones tonight from my memory for some reason. So I think he remains kind of to the side, but the fact that he wants to get rid of Nynaeve, I read mostly as annoyance. Like he really just can't be bothered with any of these people, really. I mean, that
Yeah.
he gave that attitude to the others. So I don't sense anything sinister there. I think it's just like my job is to take care of Moraine, and all these people make that harder. We move slower. We have to explain things. We can't use our kind of shorthand for it. So I think that does read at times like resentment, but especially when Moraine's like, we need her. I don't see him ever acting on that resentment or, trying to foul this up in any way.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good summation of where we're kind of at with Lan at this point. Is I think he is so under control because he is only doing what Moraine wants that we still haven't seen any of him to some degree, right? We've heard his battle cry and we know that he is the Lord of Seven Towers or something like that, and that's the entirety of what we know about Lan, right? He stabbed thing real good, right? He reminds me of like if you have a party of Dungeons and Dragons characters and there's only one tank and then the guy who's the tank goes on vacation for a month. Like you need the character to stick around. He's just not going to have any lines for the first like 3 or 4 sessions.
Yeah, I was just thinking about that. The character that somebody rolled up but became an NPC for a while.
Yeah.
Well, and that makes me think it is an interesting choice that they were kept together, right? Because how easy would it have been to shuffle them apart and really develop each of them in the app, maybe particularly him in the absence of her. But we kept them together, and so that unit maintains, and so there should be a reason for that, since all the other choices would have revealed something about the character. I mean, it'd be great to hear him bumping up against Elias, or would he have saved Tom if he was in the other chunk?
Right.
Or maybe he doesn't really have power when he's not with Moraine, or skill. We don't know. So yeah, I think I see there must be a reason they were kept together, and that has to eventually be the right choice, which I think just means I trust Robert Jordan.
And Robert Jordan is worth trusting, at least I think so. And this is actually a good place to give one of my very vague show book comparisons. Because at this point, we are kind of in like our group is broken up into 3 separate stories, more or less. And the television show condenses and adapts Perrin and Egwene's story. It condenses and adapts Rand and Matt's story. And then what in the book are just really quick glimpses of Nynaeve and Moraine and Lan. The show basically makes up an entire new plot out of whole cloth to fill in the gaps in what could have happened here, even though it's not completely in agreement with what's in the book. And so for those of you who have seen the show, you're going to see a little bit less of these three characters than you did on the show. And you're going to see a bit more of the other four, the Emmons Field boys and Egwene, simply because of the way the storytelling structure was broken down. And, as you're saying this, it's like, okay, that character actually showed up on the television show, whereas, the player wasn't around the first couple of weeks of the book.
Interesting. And you would kind of attribute that choice to just wanting to balance them all and keep those actors on the show, essentially?
Yeah, I think it's some of it is balance, and some of it is that the show, if the book obviously is primarily from Rand's POV, the show is quite a bit more from Moraine's POV. And so I think they wanted to give her something a little bit more active than walking through the woods and having a staring contest with Nynaeve is, I think, their main motivation.
And roughly speaking, we have one season of the show as we're recording this. The second is filmed, but in post-production.
That's correct. Yes. And I am making the executive decision live on air. You have not heard this yet. I discussed this with my wife. There are a few details in season 1 of the television show that are really crucial to some mysteries we've been talking about that don't show up until book 2.
Oh, so interesting.
I am strongly advocating for a 2 books, then watch a season approach from here until infinity. It probably means that we'll end up reading a decent amount that shows up in season 2 on the show before we watch season 1. Oh, well, I'd rather preserve the solid reader version of the surprises and the mysteries.
No, I completely agree with that. So I guess the rest of my question, I think you almost answered there, which is the show's first season, it doesn't exactly equate to the book then.
So the first season of the television show more or less adapts the first book of the series. There are some major modifications, there are some diversions, there are some other things that change, but more or less the entire first book, other than one chunk in the middle, which is going to be in season 2, they've already announced, is in the first season of the television show. That being said, they have talked about like an 8 or 9 season plan, and it's a 15-book series. So it's clear, even from some of the promo videos, that the second season will cover probably books 2 and 3 kind of condensed. So season 1 was book 1, but it's likely multiple books per season going forward.
It's such an interesting problem here in our IP laden entertainment world, because I was just listening to a podcast today, the Big Picture from the Ringer Network, and they were doing their top 5 fantasy films of all time. And they were talking about how kind of fantasy film had a boom in the 80s, which is largely attributed, correctly or incorrectly, to the fact that the kids who read Tolkien came of age and were creators in the 80s. And so we got a lot of fantasy. And then it kind of disappeared in the 90s, and we're in this moment where it's come roaring back, and kind of why is a good question. And they don't have a full answer
because the executive producers who came of age in the era 80s of George R.R. Martin and Robert Jordan, and that like mid 90s wave is now producing television.
Sure. And they were also noting how what that means is, in the land of prestige TV instead of films, like what would Wheel of Time look like? Like, would you do a trilogy of movies and just do like 3 of the books? And, you know, Harry Potter kind of broke from one to the other, that they proved you could do a long series. And, I think, Game of Thrones is not a perfect television show by any means, but the way in which they took the time to go deeply into like small characters was so much more enriching than like a 3-film adaptation would have been, or something like that. Right. So it's a really interesting fact that they're, as you're saying, for Wheel of Time, they have the luxury of so much content, so much IP to base it off of, and yet maybe don't want to build a plan that's exactly as long as it, because audiences lose interest. I think your audience shrinks every season, even if your show is really good. So but none of that is about these chapters, but it's interesting.
Well, and this is my area, right? I have a PhD in film economics. This is my thing. And like, I think a lot of it nowadays is just about cost, right? It's after 3 or 4 seasons, all of those young newcomer actors you signed to play Randall Thor are suddenly demanding big old contracts. And so you kind of need to have an end date in sight if you want a studio to sign on for 6, 7, 8, 9 seasons, right? You need to be planning around that. And I feel like the problem that Game of Thrones ran into is that they didn't plan around it as well as they could have, right? They needed an extra season and a half at the end there to really tell that story the way it needed. At least that's what I think. And so I'm hopeful. I know the executive producer vaguely from an alumni event, and he seems like a good dude who really cares about this story. So I'm hopeful for the show. Sorry to divert from the chapter entirely, but I think useful discussion about how we're going to be handling the show in the future, and also how much I love it. Did you have any closing thoughts either about the chapter or just kind of where we're at in the read before we kind of preview the next week?
No, update on my personal book buying habits. I haven't bought my second book yet. I still, every time I'm near a Barnes and Noble, I'm like, oh, I could swing in and grab it, but we still have a chunk left to go. So I think that's it for what I have this week. So next week will be another 2-chapter week. So we're going to do chapters 29 and 30. That's Eyes Without Pity and Children of Shadow. Again, both of which could be great mixtape songs, I think. So
absolutely.
So we're looking forward to continuing this journey, certainly. And we look forward to seeing all of you again next time on Through the Glass Columns. So ends another episode of Through the Glass Columns. We thank you for joining us and continuing with us on our quest to cover all of the Wheel of Time in our own sweet time.
This podcast features original content developed by Tylor Orm and Greg Cass and is not in any way affiliated with, associated with, or condoned by the Robert Jordan Estate, Tor Fantasy, or Amazon. All content is intended for entertainment and educational purposes only.
If you're enjoying this podcast, please seek out the books from your local bookshop or library and join us as we continue our journey. If you'd like to contact us to share your thoughts or give feedback, you can email us at throughtheglasscolumns@gmail.com or find us on Instagram and Twitter by searching Through the Glass Columns.
Thank you once again for being part of this community. If you're enjoying the show, please subscribe to the show, leave us a review wherever you're listening, and recommend this show on your social media to help us grow our community. We look forward to welcoming you back next time through the Glass Columns.